Greetings, everyone. Welcome. I am Lisa Klein-Piro, and I am here with you today from Admissionado to talk to you a little bit more about how to plan 3 to 6 months out for your MBA application. I do have a series of slides here for you today that we'll go through, and I am happy to take questions from you as I go through the slides. For each slide, I will take questions that relate to that topic. But then if you have other questions that I haven't covered, digging deeper, a little bit beyond, you can throw those in. And then at the end, when we wrap up, we'll have even more time to talk about those things. So with that, why don't we get started? As I mentioned, we are focusing today on the 3 to 6 months out. And we had a session, there were 3 live stream sessions, and this is the second one. And we're looking at this in terms of different buckets. So the first session was about what to do more than 6 months out. Today, we're talking about that 3 to 6 month window. And then in the next session, we'll be talking about that final last 3 months before the application. So I'll try to stay focused on this time frame during my presentation, but of course, I'm happy to answer questions that come up about other time periods. So let's first start out talking about from the bigger picture. And as we discussed when we looked a little bit farther out, and you can go back and see that video if you did miss this, that the strategic positioning is at the foundation of your application. And what we really focus on doing is making sure that you have a compelling trajectory. So you want to demonstrate a career arc, where you began, each step during the process, where you are now, where you intend to be long-term, and how that MBA bridges that gap between you today and your goals for you in 5 years and in 10 years. And so identifying that trajectory is really the foundation of your longer term planning. As we get into this 3 to 6 month window, we want to hone in on those different pieces of that trajectory. You want to clearly think about how your past professional experiences and accomplishments fit in to that trajectory. And it oftentimes, in life, we don't always make choices along this arc, and we will have positions we've taken on or degrees that we've pursued that may not clearly align, and that's all fine. But as you tell your story, you do want to explain more about, how you got to that point, what you learned from it, and where that sent you next. And that ability to reflect on your experiences, that demonstration of self-awareness is really critical to building credibility and authenticity with your entire application. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. Let's talk a little bit now about test taking. So at this point, 3 to 6 months out, you'll want to have a really clear strategy of whether you need to take a test initially or retake the test. You want to make sure that this test is scheduled, and whether that be the GMAT or the GRE, that really is up to you, and most schools will accept both of them. If you've taken a score that you're not particularly happy with, of course, you'll want to make sure that you have that second test scheduled. We have found in our experience that most of the time there's not great returns after 3 times. And unless something bizarre has happened that interfered with your performance in your second and third times, you might not get any really additional bang for putting in the time after that. And so what you really want to think about in test taking is if you've hit a plateau, then you might want to identify ways that you can demonstrate in your application scholastic abilities, academic achievements aside from the test taking. Another strategy, if you really do feel that you can do better, is to really hone in with a tutor on those specific areas that you're struggling with, because often it's really hard to focus on those weaknesses, that those retakes just really eliminate some of the broader areas where you might have made some silly mistakes, but honing in on those areas of weakness often takes some focused tutoring. Okay. And then what you want to do is you want to finalize that school list based on that final set of test scores. And schools use these tests as an indicator of your competitiveness academically among the applicant pool. And it's not to say it's the only indicator, but it is one that at least identifies a level playing field. They can incorporate your GPAs, incorporate scholarly work that you've done in other degrees. But again, those are not easily comparable. This is one of the few tools they have that they can look across all applicants. And you'll want to make sure that you have at least some schools in your list in which your test scores fit squarely in their range. And there are, of course, you want to think about applying to schools that are above, reach schools. But if you are clearly set on an MBA degree, you want to make sure that that final test score has a fit in your list of schools in terms of their acceptable ranges. There has been somewhat of an aberration in these years of scores when we look at what happened during COVID-19. So there were some schools that have that waived the scores during 1 year or 2 year, but if you're thinking ahead, it is most likely that these scores will come back as a critical part of the application process. So I am monitoring the chats. I don't see anything yet. So if I don't see any more, I'm just going to keep going on, but please feel free to ask any questions you have about any of these topics. Now let's talk a little bit about school research. That's a really important area where you can gather information that's going to help you in not only narrowing down your school list, but also in positioning yourself as a great fit with that school. So let's talk first about doing the research to narrow down your school list. What you'll want to do is focus on some key criteria that you have in terms of location, in terms of specialization, in terms of size, program flexibility, all of these criteria that's going to help you find a school that will deliver what you need in terms of learning outcomes and experiences. And there's really a wide range in terms of curriculum, in terms of the amount of group projects, in terms of the flexibility that you have to pick different courses and to take specializations. You'll also want to look at the different locations, and that makes a really big difference for you if you want to be in a school that's in the middle of a city and take advantage of the opportunities that the city offers to you, or if you want to be in a school that's outside of a city that has more of a self-enclosed campus, and maybe that's part of a much bigger university. Ideally, we tell people to apply to 3 to 6, but that's just a rough idea. And it can be less if you have your heart set on just 1 or 2, and more if you're definitely sure you want to go for an MBA and you are focused on creating safety, target, and reach schools. So as I mentioned before, for those safety schools, those are schools in which your GPA and your test scores would clearly place you above at the top end of their range. Target schools would be where you're right in the middle of those acceptances, and your reach schools are those which seem slightly higher, but where you would present a convincing case for your application aside from those scores. Now, let's just flip to talk a little bit about I see one question in here, and I will get right to that, Pujita. I want to just talk a little bit about using this school research to help you with your application. So as you write your essays, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit more, but this seems like a great place to talk about this part of it. But as you work on writing your essays, you really want to think about how you're going to convince that admissions committee that you are a great fit. And when you're thinking about that, you can't just rely on general platitudes of what the school offers: great faculty, ambitious students, engaging curriculum. You want to be as specific as possible, and that's going to take research. So you want to go out there and you want to identify faculty who are teaching courses that you're most interested in, and think about what kinds of research are they doing? What's really innovative about that one unique course in finance, or the one unique course in negotiations that fits into your needs, your skill gap. You also want to look at what types of extracurricular activities they offer, and then how that uniquely fits with your interests. And some other ways that you can gather that information would be to attend some events that they have online. And they will have speakers that come from student clubs, they'll have faculty speakers, admissions office, and you can gather some really specific information about how the school considers themselves unique, right? So you want to know, each school thinks that they're unique. They think their culture is unique, their program is unique. You want to understand that uniqueness and be able to fit that uniqueness in with your own story. So doing that specific research is really important. I have a question from the chat pod. Any website where I can see posts on employability and salary? So I think that what you want to look for, rather than general employability and salary, is you'll want to try to find information on specific specialization areas. It's really difficult to compare salaries overall. For example, finance graduates generally make a lot more money than human resource specialists, those who specialize in human resources. So what I would suggest that you do is first focus on that specialization area and make sure that you're looking at that. Schools will often publish that on their own websites, encouraging you to look further. U.S. News and World Report does publish some more general information on those statistics. But that is certainly something that in these sessions you can ask about that as well. I think one thing that you want to think a little bit more about when you're looking at it is, as you look at employability and salary statistics, I would skip over 2019 and 2020 and go back to see what their trajectory was before that. Because there have been a lot of issues, that have interfered with employment in these past couple of years, interfered with international postings. So you'll want to think about that. I had another question that says about the GRE or GMAT. Going back to what I had mentioned on the tests, it really doesn't matter. You can choose whichever one you want. Traditionally, the GMAT has been the standard, but that's really opened up. If you haven't taken either yet, and so now you're looking way beyond 3 months, so you're now in that beyond 6 months category. So I'd go back to the previous webinar, but I also will tell you that you might want to take a practice exam online and see which one you do better in, and there may be some differences there that can help you decide. Okay. In choosing your list of schools, you'll want to set aside, like as I mentioned, a set of criteria that you're thinking about. Look at your scores, look at your interests, as I said, geography, all of those. And then you'll want to go out and identify which schools fit into your criteria. If you go and search for top 50 MBA programs or top 50 in finance, you'll find those lists. US News and World Report, Niche, a lot of publications of these. And you can sift through these to gather the information you need to build your list. It's not going to all be in one place. You have to identify which schools fit in terms of the likelihood of you being accepted, but also in terms of what you're looking for out of the program. And Justin, I want to hold your question until I get to later on, because I want to stick with the school research here, but I didn't forget it, and I will come back to it shortly. So if we have no other questions on school research, I'll just move on to our next topic. Professional experience. What you want to start to do is document your greatest hits. So one of the things that I've seen a lot, and this is in clients that I've worked with, is people tend to want to write about themselves and their experiences in generalizations. So I am really good at solving problems. I'm very analytical. I always come up with innovative solutions. But that's not going to work as you write an essay, because there's no specifics. So you have to provide some support for your claims. And so if you can identify specific examples that support your claims, you're going to have a much stronger essay. Identifying, remembering all of those different examples, it takes some time. I think it's something you would benefit from planning ahead. So as you think about examples where you've demonstrated extraordinary leadership, or where you've acquired essential skills that are needed for your position, or you've had an impact on other people, start to jot those down, because sometimes they'll come to you when you're thinking about other things, and you'll want to have that greatest hits there for you as you fill out your application and talk about your accomplishments, build your resume, but then also as you want to start to think about weaving them into your essay. That's the most important thing, is just to keep that running tally and consider, really start to branch out and really dig into different ways that you've had an impact or can provide examples of demonstrating skills throughout past experience. So now let's talk and branch out from that into extracurriculars. What's really important in terms of the activities that you've been engaged in during school and then after school is not the number or the variety, it's your impact. And so you want to really focus on identifying ways that you have demonstrated leadership. And the top schools really focus even more so on this idea of leadership, and not leading projects, but leading other people. And so you want to identify ways in which you've been a thought leader, in which you've driven groups to accomplish their goals. If you can identify specific impacts you've had, that's even better. One thing about focus is that it's often really useful to show a demonstrated commitment to a specific area. So let's say you are pursuing a specialization in sustainability, showing that you've been involved in some community efforts that are focused on improving our environmental impact in a couple of different ways would really support your passion. Okay. And it doesn't mean that everything needs to fit in nicely. And often there are ways, if you step back and look at the things you're involved in, that you can see the theme. Okay. Perhaps you coach soccer for young kids and you've been involved in some other different ways where you've been teaching or sharing experience. That also can be a common thread. You don't need to get involved in extracurriculars, in voluntary events and committees, if they don't tie together, if it's just a little bit here and there, it's not going to really be important to you. You want to really focus on ways that you can demonstrate a commitment to a community, to a theme, right? To something that you're passionate about throughout. And I see a comment that goes back to what we talked about. I've been in the educational sector, and would that be disadvantageous? Absolutely not. Teachers have just as much leadership experience as managers do. And so what you really want to try to do is identify ways that you'll translate those experiences into important skill sets for a future career in business. And there are many different parallels. And I think that if anything, someone coming from a different type of sector might even be an edge up, because you're somewhat unique and because you've been able to demonstrate how your experiences in education can be leveraged for an impact in a corporate, nonprofit, or any other type of environment. But those experiences in developing relationships with individuals and in leadership and impact, that can really be easily identified in education. So, Ozair, I hope I've answered that question. Okay. Excellent. Okay. So let's move on to talk about letters of recommendation. Now, remember, we're 3 to 6 months out. And at this point, you really should have a really good idea of who you want to be your recommender. And one really important point that we stressed in the 6 month out is you want to stay away from inviting people who don't know you. So just because someone has an important title, that doesn't mean they'll really be someone who can credibly speak for you. You want people who can relay experiences they've had with you that corroborate the skills, talents, passions you've explained that you have. So what you want to do is start to write down the important points that you hope your recommender can get across in their recommendation. So let's say you really want to discuss how you really want to reiterate in your application how you have been able to bring together diverse groups of people on teams, okay, and manage conflict. You might want to tell your recommender that you'd love for them to share this example of this one project you worked on with people from different parts of the organization and how you moved that team towards successful completion and really managed all the obstacles that came up. So you want to make sure that your recommender can use stories that reinforce what you've already been communicating in your application. So this, you can think about it as a briefing document where you tell them sort of, this is what I'm talking about in my application. This is where I really would hope that you can come in and help to triangulate. Okay. And that's what really makes a great recommendation, is somebody that can really demonstrate how you come across to other people, what their impressions of you have been from working with you, from seeing you work with other people. So that external perspective, not from somebody who's the CEO of the organization and can, talk about their title and how they know hundreds of people and you really stand out. That seems like a letter they could write for anybody. The letter they write for you should seem like something they uniquely wrote for you. And you can help that recommender write that letter by sharing more details about what would be really important and valuable in your application. Okay. I do see a question about a GPA, and I'm going to go and we'll tackle that when we get to the end, since it doesn't really fit in with this topic. As my first recommender, my manager knows me, and as a second recommender, can I go with? I think as if you have at least one recommender who knows you really well, that's important. If you need to reach out to somebody who doesn't know you as well, I really would focus on this briefing to tell them how you would like them to add more detail. And so maybe they don't know you as well as the other person, but at least if they can, give examples of one or two interactions they've had with you, that's really important. If they couldn't pick you out of a crowd, they're not going to be somebody. If they can't give one example of the way in which you've had an impact in their organization specifically, then they're not going to be someone who would be good for you and would add value. Another question, can I give my recommender what I want them to write for me exactly? You absolutely can, but it's really up to them to decide how to tell that story. It has to be written in their voice. And if they're including what you wrote in your voice, it's going to be easy to spot. So make sure you tell them what you'd like them to say and make sure they write it in their own voice. Yeah, you can actually tell them about events they can use. You really want to be able to jog their memory, but you really want it to be things that they were a part of, that they can speak to firsthand. I wouldn't recommend things that they didn't have any knowledge of. You really want to focus on things where they saw you excel firsthand. Does that make sense? Great questions. All right. I don't see any more questions on this right now. So let me move to the resume. At this point, remember, we're 3 to 6 months out. You've already started to think about the professional accomplishments that you're going to want to include. You want to make sure your resume is down to 1 page. And generally, of course, in most business environments, 1 page is the rule. In a lot of academic or research positions, people generally are free to include more, where maybe you'd list all your publications. For this purpose here, we're going to get it down to 1 page, okay? We'll use a professional template that looks, pretty straightforward, very conservative, but it's going to be slightly different than the resume you're going to use to get hired. Here, you're focusing on impact, results, leadership, and you want to be able to quantify what you've done. So if you presented a proposal to a group of executives in your organization to launch a new product, you're going to want to talk about that impact. How many executives were at the meeting? What was the decision as a result? If you tweaked a marketing campaign, what type of increase in sales did it result in? Or increase in customer retention? So try to get some way to quantify it. It may not always be in dollars, but it can be in number of people. It can be in hours of time saved, but you really want to get that out to a metric that you can use to measure results. Okay. And as you work on this, you want to try to get some feedback from people that are ideally alumni of some of these MBA programs. And you want people to be looking at it from the perspective of an MBA candidate, not from the perspective of, should I hire you? Okay. So we don't need to know everything you did in your position. Okay. And generally, when you're applying for a job, you have a position, you want to show all of your responsibilities. If you were responsible for monitoring some metrics on a regular basis, but you really had no impact and it doesn't really show leadership or accomplishment, you don't have to include that. You just want to include those initiatives that had an impact. So start working on your resume. It often will take a little while to get it down to 1 page. There's a lot of tricks that you can search for to sort of get rid of the fluffy words, and really focus on identifying what you did and how you would measure the results. Okay. Let me just go back. So Garima, I'm going to save that for afterwards because we're just talking about the resume in this second. So I have that on hold. Esther's question goes back to the recommendation letter. Some schools will give you a word limit. If they don't, I have never seen a recommendation letter that was really good that was more than a page and a half. Sometimes it could be a page, but that's generally. But sometimes schools will be specific about the word limit. Okay. Any other questions on the resume part? Okay. So our final content slide here is going to be on the essays. So you're now, let's say, 6 months out. It really is a great time to start to think about those essays. You want to start out with a clear idea of what you want to get across. What are the key things that need to be communicated in this essay? And these will vary. And if you've taken a look at some of the essays from some of the MBA programs, some of them will ask you a wide open question. Tell me about yourself and why you'd be such a great fit for this school. Wide open. Some of them are, give us one experience where you have failed. And they're going to be very specific. So what you'll want to do is take your list of schools and you want to identify which schools you want to apply to in round 1. Shortlist those, or if you're looking at around, shortlist the ones for which the deadlines are coming up earlier and put those essays out front. And for each essay, start to identify exactly what skills and important dimensions of you that you want to communicate. When you start to write, I want you to write to that outline and to those messages, but don't focus on the grammar, the word, the style at the beginning. I think that's the thing that really strangles people in the beginning. They're like, I can't go under 500 words and my story's so much better. The easiest thing in the world is to trim your essay down. So don't worry about that at the beginning. Just write to the essay, write to answer those questions. Then when you're sure what the content will be, it'll be super easy for you to get rid of the fluff and streamline it. But the most important thing is getting the content across, telling a story, and then making sure you've answered the prompts. I've seen many situations where people have a great story to tell, wind up telling it really well, but it doesn't answer the question. And they're going to automatically not pay attention to that because, if somebody can't answer the question that I asked, it doesn't really bode well for their ability to be successful in our program. So answer the questions. And, if you're working on your own without a counselor or tutor or anyone, you want to have someone else look at it too, just to make sure that they're getting the message that you intended to communicate. So at this point, really what you're focusing on now is making sure you have an outline for each essay and that you have some idea of that content that you want to get across. Ideally, you'll be able to use some of these essays, repurpose them for other schools. So that big essay, why do you want to come here? Who are you? And tell me your story, that you can customize for different schools. So your story might be generally the same, but then if you're applying to some different programs, you might want to tweak it a little so that you can emphasize how it fits into the unique aspects of that school. And then obviously the identification of the things that you're really excited about that school, that will change, but you'll have a place for it already in your essay, and you'll be swapping things in and out. Okay. But really this sort of brainstorming at the beginning of this and writing your essays is an essential part. So don't shortchange it and try to jump to, I'm just going to write it once in under 500 words. Let yourself really write about it so that you have a lot of material to choose from as you streamline it. Okay, and then the one final thing that I want to draw out here is that the essays don't stand alone. Your application is a package. Okay, so you're submitting your resume, your transcripts, your letters of recommendation, your test scores. You want your essay to add something to the package. It shouldn't repeat everything that's in your resume. You want it to add to multidimensionality to those other components. So make sure that they complement one another. Right? If you have 2 essays, and many schools will have 2 or even more, you'll want the essays to complement one another. So if you have a general question like I just mentioned, how do you fit here? You'll tell your story, and then if there's another question that asks you something like, tell us a little bit more about how you incorporate diversity in your approach to collaboration. Make sure that you're adding a different perspective. You might not want to tell the same story you told in your main essay. Use it as an opportunity to deepen the committee's understanding of who you are. So let me look here. Do we have to mention what we can contribute in the essay? Well, it depends on what the essay question is. If the essay question is, tell us about your greatest failure, or an example of a success, no. If the question is, tell us about you and how, why it's important for you to come to the school, absolutely. Because admissions committees aren't just picking you because you deserve to be in this class. They're picking you because you can contribute to the cohort. They want to pick an ideal group of people who will create more from the sum than they did individually. They want someone who will be a part of a community that they can make better because they're there. So if you have a question that asks about your fit or tell us why you want to apply to this program, you absolutely have to show how you can contribute in the classroom, outside of the classroom, as an alumni. You really, any of those, all of those, but that contribution piece is important. Arfi says he's going, so let me just, those are going back to letters of recommendation. Any other questions on the essay? Because this brings us to the end, and so I can broaden it and start to go back to all the questions that we've had. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to open this up and I'm going to go through the questions that have been asked, and then just keep typing them in. So I see Arfi has one here that that the question is, you have a reliable source for a letter of recommendation from the professional side. If a school asks for an academic recommendation, you're going to need an academic recommendation. If they ask for 2 and they give you some leeway, absolutely. So you're going to need a way, if you're applying, the example is on London School of Economics, you're going to need to have academic LORs. And that might entail you going back to faculty that you've worked with in your undergraduate programs, and you may have to refresh them on who you are and what you contributed. But yes, you want to make sure that you're providing them with exactly what they've asked for. Okay, and I'm going to just start scrolling back here. So one question is, when to start writing the essays, while preparing for the GMAT or after? I think while, because regardless of which schools you apply to, how high your GMAT is, you're still going to have to write your essays. So those are independent of the targets. And if you start on a more general essay, just ideas that you want to express, then once you get closer and have that list of schools, you can start narrowing down that essay. But I'd start the brainstorming as early as possible. Garima asked, you have a great GPA score, but you didn't complete your undergraduate degree and have been working as a co-founder. I gather that European schools are more forgiving. I'm not sure. You said, do you think I should apply? So I think that's going to be something for you to ask in the admissions office. For most US programs, you do need to have evidence of an undergraduate degree. And there may be opportunities for exceptions that I'm not entirely familiar with, which you might have to do on a case-by-case basis. Okay. Someone had said, I don't have a good GPA for my bachelor's degree. How can I compensate for that? Well, I'm not sure your specific situation. The longer you've been out of school, the less your GPA matters. That being said, the more experience you have where you can demonstrate impact, the less your GPA matters. If you can demonstrate excellent test scores, it can overcome the GPA. If you have an exceptional reason for a low GPA, and I've had a number of clients, for example, I had somebody who realized while they were an undergraduate after the first 2 years that they had a learning disability that had never been diagnosed. And once they realized this and sought out help, then they were able to overcome it, and their GPA was much better in their junior and senior years of college. And that was a terrific story. And my client wrote a great additional essay to explain that and explain what he did and what he learned from it, which was how to speak up for himself and ask for the resources that he needed. Again, that's an anomaly in a way, a little bit, probably not as common, but really being able to explain what the rationale was for having a low GPA. I had a client who was had a goal of being a professional soccer player and was playing semi-professionally, and really looked back and said, I probably devoted too much time to that and not to my academics. But he explained that in his essays, how he was focused on being successful and that he made some poor choices academically, or going back, he might do it over differently, but this was a dream that he wanted to pursue and he felt like he needed to give it his all. And that sort of puts it into context. So if you can explain why your GPA was so low in a way that you could show what you learned from it, or why what trade-offs you made, I think that can help you tell your story. Okay, I'm just scrolling back. All right, that you completed your undergrad within 3 years. And this was a significant effort. Well, what I would do, first of all, they're going to be able to realize you did it in 3 years if the years are on your resume. Okay, you might be able to squeeze that in the resume, completed a bachelor's degree, 3 years. There's also a way you might be able to work it into an essay. Okay, so if you're talking about some accomplishments, and let's say you were talking about a position that you held in an extracurricular organization, you can casually mention it. I don't think it's tactless at all, but you have to put it into context to show, what does that mean? What do you want it to get across about you? Justin, do you want it to really show that you are ambitious, that you can work efficiently, you're motivated? So make sure that you really put it into context in terms of what you think it communicates about your abilities to be successful in an MBA program and to be successful in your career after your MBA program. Okay, I think if I am correct that I've covered everything that came in before. So now let me see what has come in since. Okay, in my resume, how do I show my professional progression while at one company over a number of years? Well, the first thing is, ideally, you've had a couple of different titles. Okay, and that's definitely progression. If you haven't had a different title but have, let's say, stayed in one role, what you'll want to do is you can attach dates to different projects. So 2015 to 16, in charge of this and achieve this, 17 to 18. So you can put that into context to show increasing amount of responsibility and impact over time. Okay. I'll get to the essay length in just a minute. I saw another one that I wanted to comment on. I've just completed my bachelor's. I'm going to give the GMAT, take the GMAT. Yeah, can you apply for starting in September? No, you're too late for that. Can you apply now in the fall for next year? Yes. And that's something you'll want to look at. Most schools do not like to hire people right out of their bachelor's degree for an MBA program because you haven't had business experience. There are schools that are now developing sort of deferred admittance, or they call them 2+2 programs, where they'll admit you now and then you can go out and work for a while and then come back. But in order to get into those competitive programs, you have to have done something extraordinary in your undergraduate that shows, why you would need to apply now and what you're really going to do with your 2 years. There are some programs that will accept you right out of undergraduate, but it will limit the schools that you can apply for if you're focused on going right away. In general, they like to see people with some business experience. So, I see a couple questions about the average length. 95% of schools are going to give you the length that they want. Okay. So there's no ideal length. It's whatever they tell you. So if they tell you not more than, 1,500 words, then it's not more than 1,500 words. There are few schools, HBS being one of them, that do not give you a word length. So I would suggest that you focus on the word lengths that you've created for the other schools and keep it within that range. Because the worst thing you can do when there's no word length is go on and on and on. So I wouldn't worry as much right now about your word length, because most schools will tell you what the limit is for the purposes of reducing the number of people who go on and on and on, and making sure that you're being concise in telling your story. Okay. So the mandatory and optional, as I mentioned, most schools will give you a limit, and they're generally going to say, they'll say it in words. It'll be 1,000 words or 800 words. They're going to tell you. So if you go out now, schools have their applications open. You can take a look. Most of them will have a word limit. Okay, please let me know if I missed any questions that have come in. I tried to scroll back, but I think I have answered everything in the chat pod. So please, we have a couple minutes left. So if you have any other questions, please put them in there. Okay. All right. Yes. So if you do want to contact us, when you see the slides, our information address is right here. Let me just get you to that again. There you go. That's our website. And that's the general admissions information mailbox. And you can ask anything. What is the ideal preparation time? That's a hard question. Let me flip it back to you. So what you want to do is, what I would recommend is take a practice test online on your own, just your own. See how far you are from your ideal score in that practice. If you're really far, or if there's a big gap, or if, let's say, if it's either the verbal or the quantitative, that's not where you want it to be, then you want to focus on that preparation piece. And you'd ideally want to give yourself a few months to do that, but it really depends on how much time you have. If you have a full-time job, you're not going to be able to accomplish that much each day. And maybe you'll be thinking about doing your work on the weekends. If you don't have a full-time job, or you have more flexibility in your schedule, you can condense it. So I wouldn't focus as much on the time as on making sure that you are addressing your weaknesses in a way that allows you to really progress. So start as early as you can. Take that practice and then really identify where you want to focus. I wouldn't just keep on practicing in general without identifying weaknesses so you can be the most efficient in your practice. So great question. Is management experience necessary for admission? Not at all schools. For some of the top tier schools, yes. For some of the, let's say if we move out of the top 5 MBA programs, you can focus on your analytical skills. So that's a real differentiator. And especially some MBA programs that are really focused on the quantitative end, then you can apply without management experience. But what I want to mention too is that just because you haven't had an official leadership title does not mean you don't have leadership experience. Sometimes the more impressive leadership experience is based on being able to influence people without a formal position of authority. So if you're working as an engineer and you're on a project and you've had people who were, not buying into this innovative way that you want to approach this design, and you've somehow won them over to your side and you've influenced them, that's leadership, right? If you've been working at in a community effort where you've been organizing meals for people who, meals for homeless people, let's say, and you came up with a new initiative about ways to organize volunteers or ways to reach out to food providers, that's leadership. So don't look at leadership as just formal authority. Think about ways that you've influenced other people. And if you can communicate that you've done this in many respects without any authority, in some ways that's even more impressive. Okay. Great question. You're applying for the MIM for fall 22, but when should I have my GMAT attempted? So it depends on which cycle you want to get into with your application. The first application deadlines are going to be, September, October. And then they go on through the spring. If you could have your GMAT completed by the end of this summer, you'd be in a great position because you'd be able to really assess which are your safety, target, and reach schools. What should you do if you don't have a significant extracurricular? It is definitely too late for this year's application, so we're looking at applying now. If you don't have a significant extracurricular, then you'll want to figure out ways in your application to communicate why not. What have you been involved in work? Has work overtaken your world? Have family responsibilities overtaken your world? Have you been particularly impacted by COVID and not had any opportunity to contribute? So I think if you have nothing outside of your application, you'll want to make sure that in some way you address why there aren't outside activities. And there are many great reasons why you would not. I've worked with a number of candidates in the military who they don't have extracurriculars because there really isn't any opportunity in their jobs to be involved in things outside of their main responsibility. I've worked with people who have had severe COVID restrictions where so many of the things that they usually engage in were now off the table. And so that's an explanation. So you really want to focus on identifying how you can tell your story, Karina. I wouldn't recommend just participating in something now because we're already in July. So if you're applying in September, you don't really have much time to have an impact. Excellent questions. All right. Okay. Great. I don't see any more questions now, but those have been excellent questions. And so please continue. There have been a lot of resources that have been shared with you during this webinar. And there was one that came before this, and I think the links to the recordings were shared as well. And then there will be another one where we'll focus on that final window in those 3 months before your application. So thank you all for attending, and thanks for being so engaged and asking such great questions. Go ahead. I'm ready for a last question. Go ahead. It's a hard question to answer. Is the MIM valuable? Yes. It just really depends on where you're applying and what you can show as your accomplishment. So if it really fits in with the objective that you have, the career goal you have, it can be valuable. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap up now. On this final screen, you'll see Admissionado's information for our website and for an email where you can gather more information. You can also go on to the website and look at some of the consultants that we have and our additional services. Thank you so much for joining us today.